Please welcome to the stage Kevin Boyce from Adelphi Bank, Rob Blackwell, Terrence Woodbury, Jerron Smith, and Greg Schultz for a conversation on the 2024 election, sponsored by IntraFi.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you once again for the opportunity to convene. The National Bankers Association is a critical engine to a conversation that is far more broader than what we as banking institutions can achieve. It's the collective voice and the collective strategy that's most important. Let me set the stage for the panel, which, by the way, is, you may or may not know, this is a star-studded panel, and I'm going to let them present on their own to show you that this is, I feel honored to be sitting with you, gentlemen. I sincerely mean that. Let me just set the stage very briefly. Recall in 2002, with the collapse of companies like Enron, WorldCom, Tyco Corp, et cetera, the impact and the response of Sarbanes-Oxley legislation that had sweeping implications, not just for corporate America, but also the financial institutions that exist in that world as well. And then forward in time to 2008-ish, with the collapse of institutions like Lehman Brothers and Wachovia, et cetera, and then the policy outcome of the Dodd-Frank Act and the implications for financial institutions alike as well. The bottom line is that policy implications can be a critical impact to not only the banking industry, but to the globe in the broader sense. And so this conversation is a political and policy conversation that I think is food for thought, but more importantly, an investment in our broader strategy and the potential thereof, given the potential outcomes of this election in less than 30 days. So with that, on the panel today, as was introduced, we have myself, founder and vice chairman of Adelphi Bank, one of America's newest MDI institutions, Rob Blackwell, chief content officer and head of external affairs for IntraFi, Terrence Woodbury, CEO and founding partner of HIT Strategies, Jerron Smith, partner, CGCN Group, and then Greg Schultz, former advisor to Presidents Biden and Obama. And so let's dig right in, gentlemen. And I'll start with you, Terrence. We were on a call just the other day, maybe a day or two ago, and you were giving political implications for a particular segment of our population. But today, we're talking about the impact on financial institutions. What key issues are currently driving voter sentiment? And more importantly, how do they differ among the different demographics, kind of like what you were talking about just the other day?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you for the NBA for having us here. And thank all of you. I'm a pollster. I know this is a bipartisan convening. I'm a pretty partisan pollster and currently doing polling for the Democratic Party and for the Kamala Harris's campaign. The other thing about being a pollster is that I'm pretty useless without slides. So the answer to the question is on the slides, right? This is top issues that voters are considering in this next election. As you see at the top, this is across across racial groups, some gender and some generational breaks here. The first thing you see here is that this is a cost election. I'm sure you've heard a lot of people talk about this being an economy election. That's only partially true. Every election is an economy election, but economy means something different every time. In 2008, economy meant foreclosures, and at the height of the recession, it was unemployment and foreclosures. In 2020, economy was about reopening and recovering from the pandemic. Today, economy means cost. That is what voters are telling us in focus groups. That's what they're telling us in these polls. Not even inflation. Inflation is what we do in banking. Cost is what they're talking about. The cost of groceries, cost of housing, cost of healthcare. But along with that, you do see some variance by demographic, right? Along with cost that everybody's concerned about, you see young people really prioritizing abortion. That is going to be a driving force of this election for young people and for women. And then you see black folks always, this is racism and discrimination will always be a top issue for black folks. The only time it's not is if the pollster didn't include it, which a lot of them don't. But those are the issues that are going to drive this election, and the issues that I think that we're going to see the most spending on: cost, abortion, and defending democracy, which means something different depending on what side is saying it.
All right, I'm gonna tell both Jerron and Greg, I'm coming to you because we're gonna really set this up. But I'm gonna go to Rob here because you two are gonna go together. We're gonna let them duel it out. But Rob, this next question is for you. Who do you think would be appointed as regulators under Harris or the Trump administration, and what are the implications on a policy level from that?
So that's a really good question. And when we look at the two choices, we have a pretty good idea of what a Harris administration would look like in terms of the federal regulators, because so many of them would stay on. You'd still have Rohit Chopra as CFPB director. His term extends well into a Harris administration. You still have Sandra Thompson at FHFA. You would have potentially a new FDIC chair, but we even get a sense of probably who that is. President Biden has nominated Christy Romero Goldsmith to succeed Marty Grunberg as FDIC chair. There's a little bit of ambiguity out there of whether or not that would be a Harris presidential pick, but most people would say yes, because the Harris administration has so many people that it would have to pick in a new administration. It may not want to go back and reinvent the wheel on that one. So we know who those are. We don't necessarily know some of the big things, like who would be Treasury Secretary. It's probably not going to be Janet Yellen. The thinking is that she doesn't want another term as Treasury Secretary. So that has a trickle-down effect on what other Treasury picks you're going to have, and whoever the Treasury Secretary nominee is going to have a lot of influence in that, and that includes on OCC. So in terms of policy, I think you see a lot of the continuation of the Biden-Harris policies. Certainly, you're going to continue to see a fairly aggressive CFPB when it comes to financial activities. You may see some difference with the FDIC. A new chair always comes in and will reevaluate. But there's a lot of items that are probably going to be left over from the current administration that are going to get finalized in some form. They're going to take a run at Basel III, a reproposal, some trying to raising capital on that. They're going to take a run at liquidity regulations, because that's something coming out of the failures of Silicon Valley Bank and 2 other regional banks last year, right? So that's what they're going to look at. So we sort of know what we're going to get. With a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, we really don't. One thing we do know is it used to be when you got a new administration, there were all these, it took a while for the financial regulators to roll over and change, and now it's not going to be that way at all. So we almost from the get-go, the Supreme Court has said the CFPB director and the FHFA director can both be fired at will. So expect them both to be gone. That's Rohit Chopra, Sandra Thompson, they're gone. I would the FDIC board, because of the way it works, the CFPB is on that board. There's an acting comptroller. He would also be out of a job, on Inauguration Day, more or less. So the FDIC board would immediately come under Republican control, and there would be a lot of Republicans in Congress that would be calling on President Trump to fire Marty Grunberg. So we would have a new FDIC nominee. Probably in that case, it's going to be Travis Hill, who's the vice chair. So we at least have some sense of who that might be. You could see Jonathan McCarran, who's a Republican on the FDIC board. He could end up in another spot, maybe at OCC, maybe at CFPB. Some other names that you might recognize: Mark Calabria, he's the former head of the FHFA under the first Trump administration. He could be someone that's going to come back at Treasury. What we really don't know is there's a populist streak to the Trump campaign. I'm sure you all have noticed that. There's certainly a populist streak in the choice for vice president. So what we don't know are how populist are some of these other choices going to be. And that's, it sort of depends on who you listen to on that one. I know some business leaders who think that the populist rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign is just that. It's rhetoric. It's not going to take a heavy form. But I know others who think, no, it's sincere. They're going to push these policies, and people like J.D. Vance will have a voice in picking these. He's on the banking committee. He may care more about these kind of issues than, say, President Trump himself, who has now, suggested a 10% cap on credit card interest rates, for example. So that's a very populist thing to do. So it's really a balance between, we're more or less going to see more of the same if we get a Harris administration, maybe some different faces in there mixed in, but a lot of the same faces. With the Trump, it's difficult to know. It sort of depends on who's having influence in that transition. And I think at this point, the Trump campaign itself isn't really thinking about this yet. That'll be a problem for another day if they win.
With policy changes come to faces that impact those policies. So I'm glad you set this up, and now it's time to get into it. We've got both Jaron Smith, Republican strategist, and Greg Schultz, Democratic strategist. And so given what was just shared by Rob, what economic issues do you see as top priorities for your respective party? And most importantly, how do these issues differ from one party to the next? And who wants to go first?
I'll go first, yeah. So we actually not only Republican Democrat, but east side of Cleveland and west side of Cleveland. So we've got some really flips of the coins here. But both have young kids at home, so we have lots of bonding. So it's hard right now with less than a month to separate the politics and the policy. So I'm not going to really try. I think what Terrence said is really important, that this is a cost election. If you're Vice President Harris and her campaign, you have a challenge because you had a very successful president on the economy. And when I say economy, I mean IRA, Infrastructure, CHIPS Act, which are generational investments. Generational investments are great, but you don't always feel generational investments today or tomorrow. And so you're hearing the campaign talk a lot about things that, like, what affects your pocketbook. And what affects your pocketbook? Again, rising childcare costs, rising senior care costs. So those are things like tomorrow, if you're paying less for childcare, you feel that. Versus we realign the global economy and shift processing chips from Taiwan to the United States, as important long term, but less impactful in today. I think if you're a Democrat, every time you look at polling, or that I've looked at polling, you see that people really do think that the billionaire CEOs are getting away with things. And I think the message of a billionaire's secretary shouldn't pay a higher rate than the CEO is paying. And so there's always some resonance, not quite Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, but there is always some resonance in the fact that this is an unfair hand, and it feels like the middle class and those working to be in the middle class have been dealt kind of the lesser hand. So you're going to see that kind of argument being pushed by Harris, both now and into an administration. What I would also say, just to set Jaron up a little bit, is if you're the Harris campaign, you also want to talk about the economy and you want to talk about the Trump taxes in terms of tariffs. And I think while Biden certainly had tariffs, I think most people would say they were more strategically deployed versus a scattershot of a Trump tariff. And so part of the thing, you've heard the campaign talk to varying levels of success or effort, but around the tariffs Trump is pushing, and that actually is a 20% tax, which again goes to your bottom line of what you're buying tomorrow will be 20% more expensive because of the tariffs that Trump said he's going to impose.
Okay. Jaron?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to get in front of this audience, National Bankers Association. I really enjoyed the opportunity to kind of work with your member banks during the Trump administration. I think that, one, President Trump has been president before, so let's not pretend that he doesn't have some individuals that are not going to come back. I'll start with Lighthizer, being the person who negotiated the USMCA trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. Him being a main role in the administration would have some downstream effects. So depending on where he goes, whether it's State Department or Treasury, that opens up opportunities for maybe Senator Haggerty and a number of prudential regulators to probably come back, like Yelena McWilliams or some other individual. So I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some people who served the prudential regulators before come back, chiefly because the Supreme Court kind of ruled and kind of cut their time served very short. And so that brings us to a policy regime, which has been something that President Trump's probably led on from the beginning. China and unfair trade agreements have always been a big economic policy, as well as reforming our tax code. In this case, it's making Trump tax cuts permanent. I think regardless if Trump wins or Harris wins, keeping half of the TCJA tax cuts alive is going to be bipartisan support, because the reality is that there were plenty of tax cuts for the middle class, and that's one thing Republicans and Democrats agree upon, which is why tax reform extension is going to happen in some type of way. But I think even if you're looking at broad-based policies around tariffs, they'll also do something very innovative like getting rid of income taxes for most Americans, which was talked about a lot. But I think that what you're going to see in the Trump administration is nuances and kind of thinking outside the box as it relates to a lot of the economic issues, which made them really successful with growing the economy the last time around. And in fact, the tariffs that you discussed, Biden currently putting in place are the same tariffs that Trump put in place originally. And so I think that there would be a lot more pragmatism than you think, because, I mean, at the end of the day, for him to pass anything, it'd have to pass through the Senate. And though the House is probably going to, if it's a Republican House, they'll probably follow the president's lead on a more populist direction with reforming the tax codes and doing tariffs. You still have a Senate that's going to probably take a more traditional take towards reforming our tax code and dealing with taxes. But the number one things is going to be looking at how we can do trade, reforming our tax code. Of course, Republicans are always supportive of a deregulatory agenda, so a lot of deregulations to try to unleash some of the power of the private sector. And then lastly, just an overall emphasis on U.S. manufacturing and incentives to try to bring manufacturing back. Now, the last thing I'll say is that, of course, with all of these different levers, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about ways to kind of grow capital infrastructure, which I spent a good amount of time kind of working in the Trump administration around and seeing how we can kind of reposition CDFIs and MDIs in a way to kind of grow those entities. The mentor protege program was something that took off very, very heavily during the Trump administration with major banks. And I can see us kind of looking at ways outside the box to grow community banking and kind of bring back a lot of Main Street lending.
Can I say one thing,
yeah,
Kevin?
please,
Because there's one very consistent theme here that you heard from these three brothers about, from the perspective of policy, regulation, and personnel, that I think is also true from the perspective that I look at politics, which is the perspective of voters. And that is that this is very much so a second term for either one of these candidates, right? That is how voters are seeing it. They're choosing which second term they want. And I think that's also how policy and personnel will play out.
Excellent. You've really set me up for the next one. Can you put the survey results back up too, if you don't mind? I just want everybody to see it, because the question was asked: what are your 2024 election out predictions? No, I meant the crowd survey. What are the 2024? There it is. There you go. And I wanted to ask each of the panelists to respond to this. Because, the Senate, you've got, a seat difference. You've got in the House, I think it's 5 or 6 up to 5 or 6 now difference, but that's very thin margins, no matter how you look at it. And then the presidential election. And so most people, it seems, in this room feel like there's going to be a divided results of the election. How does that impact your answer to the last question in terms of if it is a divided government, no matter what the breakout is from the president to the Senate to the House, what does that look like, and what are the implications, particularly to the financial markets, from a divided government?
I can answer it. Well, I would say that in a divided government, I've seen President Trump even being, he was polarizing the last time he was president, and in a divided government was able to pass USMCA. And so if you have some of the kind of decision makers like Lighthizer, who's kind of gained respect on both sides, you can see some economic policy coming out that, to me, both sides can probably support. If the House changes, that's new leadership under Hakeem Jeffries. That's different than maybe Nancy Pelosi's leadership. But I also see an opportunity with Hakeem Jeffries and Senator Scott maybe chairing the banking committee to kind of doing something outside the box around capital access and minority entities. That's what I predict, just based off of the agenda. But I think all in all, like with the populist kind of leanings of Boyce both campaigns. I think we'll be surprised even in a divided government. There may be some areas to kind of formulate around the economy. I do worry though if Harris wins, there may be some hardening on the Republican side against their agenda if she continues some of the Biden policies that has happened. But it's I always try to look at things optimistically and looking at the places where we can kind of get things done together.
Yeah, and I want everyone to answer this question, but I throw out to the strategists in particular the history of presidential election outcomes and its natural sort of course of a variety of leadership, so Republican, Democrat, whatever. So can you add that into your comments too, so we can kind of know what to expect out of this election, because historically it would suggest that it's probably going to be a mix.
Yeah, and I would say historically when you have a president win, you're likely to see the House follow that same party. I think when we're talking about divided government right now, it's really important that it's not just divided, but it is by the margins. I think Democrats can control the House by 2 votes, and I think Republicans control the Senate by 1 seat. And yes. my hopeful optimism of Northeast Ohio is that actually gives power to the moderates. Sometimes when either party wins and it's a little bit more of a mandate or a little bit of a margin, they're willing to come out of the gates a little bit more extreme. And as a moderate Democrat, I worry about the far left and the far right. So I do think history will tell us whoever wins the presidency will win the House. History tells us as a guide until it doesn't tell us as a guide. So I actually don't think that's that most likely outcome that is necessarily going to happen this time. If what I'm saying is if Trump wins, I think Democrats still control the House. And I don't know if that top of that, because it's so close that I don't think whoever wins, it will have brought a wave at the congressional House level and the Senate level to really give that coattail argument. No one's mentioned the word coattails, I think, maybe for like 8 years now. And you're not going to hear that word again, at least in the next 30 days. So that again gives us just margins, and maybe that means temperance and moderation win.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be a little more specific with that. Like, let's just look at the Senate. So the Senate map looks favorable towards Republicans just because of Montana specifically. That's likely to kind of go Republican. There's some other seats like Ohio, Maryland, which are going to be more of your kind of contested seats. But like the likelihood that we kind of win Montana is pretty strong. I think it's less
Virginia,
which
is already done. It's done. Yeah,
it's already gone. And that's what's going to kind of sway the Senate. Now the question is that do we get 2 extra seats, which is not likely, because you also have Pennsylvania, which is a bigger margin. I think we're less likely to get, but those are 3 seats that could swing: Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. But not really likely because you have really strong Democratic candidates kind of running for re-election. But to your point, West Virginia and Montana swings that. But in the House, it's kind of different because you're looking at New York seats and California seats, and they're really highly contested. So I see that even if President Trump wins the presidency, there's a strong likelihood that those seats could still swing to the Democrats, and there's a likelihood that like we can have a president, that one Pennsylvania, one Georgia, and kind of that's how he squeaks out the election in North Carolina.
That's how she squeaks out the election.
or that. But I think it's hard. It's going to be harder for Republicans to keep the House. Is my point.
What I would also say, no one had on their bingo card 6 months ago is Nebraska in the Senate race,
right.
And there's an independent populist, and that used to be a Democratic word, but thanks to Trump, it's now just a populist who has said he'll caucus with neither. There is a chance that he wins, and
he's had 2 polls showing him 2 points up, which was not expected, and the Democrats haven't put any money into that race, so he's doing that on his own. Actually, I agree with everyone saying here. I think the Senate, the odds favor the Republicans. I think John Tester has been a reliable moderate for banks, like a real bank ally on the Senate Banking Committee. He's running about 8 points behind based on a poll today. That's a bad position for him to be in. Now, he has pulled out of some things before, but I wouldn't count on it. Sherrod Brown, Senate Banking Committee chair. Right now, he's pulling about 1 or 2 points ahead, and he's helped by his opponent, has a habit of sort of putting his foot in his mouth, saying some things that he probably shouldn't, and so it hasn't been that race is benefiting him. You don't hear a lot of split ticket voting anymore, but this could be the election that's a little different because there are plenty of people, for example, that are Republicans who don't particularly like Trump, who are going to vote for Harris, but then are very willing to vote for the Republican candidate. And then there's some other things working against it. One thing I will say back to the point about personnel is if you have a Republican Senate that obviously constrains a President Harris on her financial services picks, one thing that I think is a little underrated is that, or just not talked about a lot, when Biden came into office, he owed a lot to progressives. He'd had to run to really win their trust and seize the nomination in the first place. Harris doesn't have that. She didn't have a primary race in any kind of normal sense, so she doesn't owe quite as much to the progressives and may not feel, in this case, when she's facing a Republican Senate, she can go to them and say, listen, I can't pick some of the more left or more aggressive financial regulators because I just won't be able to get them through. So it will be a constraint of sorts on her and push her probably a little bit more to the middle.
Terrence?
So look, first I want to state the obvious that that 5 guys on a panel predicting the outcome of this election means that we're all probably wrong because the most likely voter in this election is going to be women. So I just want to state that obvious fact right there. Women.
Oh, Terrence, stop it. Stop it.
Know your audience, bro.
Clearly.
Women and young people are going to determine the outcome of this election, and they've been determining the outcome of every election since Dobbs, and that should give Republicans a lot of caution. I am not so certain that it is. Look, I think the thing that I'm most confident about is Speaker Hakeem Jeffries holding a gavel. That is the most likely outcome that I am confident in. Those other 2 races, I'm not so sure, and one of them I'm looking at the numbers every day. Because there is no poll that can predict who's going to win this presidential election. They're all too close. They're all within the margin of error, and they will be for the foreseeable future. Polls are not predicting outcomes. Stop using them for that. And then the last thing I'll say is the outcome that concerns me the most and that I think will have the greatest impact on markets is a protracted contested election. It is the fact that elections don't end based on who gets the most votes. I'm pretty confident that Kamala Harris can get the most votes in the states that she needs to win. That's not how that's not how this is going to be determined. It's going to be determined by which votes get counted. It's going to be determined by which courts make decisions. Are those courts being decided in Georgia? Are those courts being decided in Pennsylvania? Are those courts being decided right here in Washington? That is what's going to decide the outcome of this election, and that is what has the greatest impact on destabilizing the market.
Terrence, you talked about something on our call the other day about, and I know this was a particular segment of the population, but I'm interested if it transfers here, and that voters having an appetite to see more of a mixed government structure. Do you see that same presentation transferring in the broader presidential election or broader federal election lineup?
I mean, that's very, very Ohio, you know.
I don't know what that means.
You know, it's a little Ohio nice. Like they want to play nice. They want both sides to get along. You know, there is a deepening and hardening of partisanship that is not just one side disagrees with the other, one side doesn't like the other, one side in fact hates the other, one side, you know, that also is a thing that is concerning me in politics more broadly, not over the course of one election, that I don't think is sustainable, is just kind of the vitriol between both sides. But there are more and more, and I think that this gets to the answer to your question, young people are demanding more balance, right? Young people, millennials and Gen Z, are more likely to identify as independent as they are to identify with either party. And that independence is not just a party badge. That independence is a part of their political identity, and they look for a place down ballot to vote across the line to validate their independence, right? They want to prove that independence. It's a badge of honor that they're not being herded like the rest of us. I hear this in focus groups every day. I don't want to choose between the lesser of two evils. I don't want to be herded. That's why I'm independent. I could vote for either side, and they look for those opportunities on the ballot.
Okay. One, I want to encourage you all to begin. If you've got questions, go ahead and send them up, or however the process is here. Yeah. But Rob, I want to turn to you. And with regards to MDIs, we know that the ESIP program has had a meaningful impact. What impact do you see, or do you foresee, on banking regulations under a Harris and Trump administration? And so I'm thinking of in the context of like an ESIP.
Yeah, I think it's important to see, to Jaron's point, a continuation of this is the second term for both presidents, so you sort of have a sense of where they're going to do it. Obviously, a Harris administration, I think, is going to put a lot of emphasis on ESIP, certainly be very supportive. The Biden administration has been, put an enormous amount of money into ESIP. So I think that will continue. I think the focus of there will be a new Treasury Secretary, but I'd be shocked if they didn't pick that up and run with it. And I think certainly the administration will view it as very valuable. In a Trump administration, again, it's going to depend partly on who's picked for Treasury, what data they're looking at, whether or not MDIs are able to make the case that this is something that's valuable, that's making a real difference in communities. So I have you can look at the first Trump administration and take some lessons from that. But I think the challenge is a little bit harder. The hill's a little bit tougher, because I think you're really going to have to go in there and prove your case that this is something that is valuable and should be maintained.
Jaron, Greg, you want to take a stab at that question?
No, I mean, honestly, we did a lot of work with MDIs. I think it's just broadening the market set to also think about some of the rural community banks as well, and who may be dealing with the same challenges. I mean, when you look at kind of things like the suing of Fearless Fund, I think that just kind of, I was listening a little bit to the last panel on the DEI piece, kind of broadening it to kind of look at historically disadvantaged communities, which kind of takes you away from like the racial piece, but the pure economic piece of it. It presents opportunities to figure out how do we kind of help with capital structures for kind of all underserved communities.
But speaking of that, I mean, I think you just set up the next question, and I hope everyone chimes in on this one. You heard the discussion about DE&I, and the potential attack or not on DEI efforts. How do you see each administration responding to the DE&I conversation? And is there a difference? Maybe they're the same.
They are not. We're not about to do this false
so Terrence, let's start with you.
We're not doing that
now. Tell us how you really feel. Let's start with you, Terrence. But I like everybody to answer the question, because in all seriousness, it depends on the lens to which you look from. So I'd like everybody to answer that question. Terrence, let's start with you. Tell us how you really feel.
I am trying to soften my remarks a little bit.
Don't soften it. Don't soften it. We want the real deal here. That's what this is.
Look, when you have committed to remove any mention of race and diversity from every federal policy and legislation, I think ignoring race is racist.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Rob, you want to?
I think you are going to see an administration, a Trump administration that is extremely skeptical. I know certainly if we have a podcast, and I've been talking to 4 of the candidates to lead the House Financial Services Committee, and I can tell you all 4 are very, very skeptical of DEI and so-called woke. They've conflated it with other issues. They're very worried about ESG policies and very worried about activist investors and pushing a line. So I mean, I don't think I'm telling anyone in this audience something they don't know, which is that the Republicans are very, very skeptical of that and are going to be looking hard at those programs and have already succeeded in some ways of making it a political issue that banks are backing away from.
So
okay. Well, let's let Greg, I'm going to let you bring it home on this question, but Greg, you go next. And then Jaron,
I think this speaks to a broader challenge Democrats have, is that Democrats lose the framing conversation out of the gates all the time, right to life, right to work. All of these efforts just get this, the woke agenda. And one of the reasons, if at the end of the day, more independents think Harris is less woke than they do today, her chances of winning go up. And so out of the gates, how does she show she's an administration that is focused on all Americans, not woke America? And I realize in this room we can tell the difference, and what woke America wants actually is what a lot of us probably want, even though we wouldn't call ourselves woke. I think what will happen is you'll see DEI under a different name, and a lot of it's just empowering the right people and supporting them and lifting them up. And I would want to believe the Biden-Harris administration did that, and the Harris administration would continue that. I do just think we lose the framing war. I mean, if you go on TV in Ohio, on the Senate race, everything is about transgendered. And it's like, how is, out of everything going on today, how is this the deciding factor? I think so. Whatever Democrats' policies, we have to make sure it doesn't sink our politics, which then sink our policies.
All right, Jerron.
Well, look, I'm just going to take a different take on this. So, look, I've always been a person who advocated for the term diversity. I'm also a person who always advocated for equity. I think that when we look at DEI, ESG, and quote-unquote woke, I mean, look, when I was in college, I considered myself a conscious brother. You know, that's before woke. It came with this. And I just think that it's gotten a black eye because in practice, it hasn't equaled what we want it to be. You know, many of these companies hired a DEI person that never really did anything but go to conferences. They didn't diversify the C-suite. You know, they didn't do things that were mutually beneficial for companies. You know, I'm not saying all companies acted that way. I thought J.P. Morgan actually took a really good approach at how they actually put their money where their mouth is. But there's a lot of corporates that made these huge commitments that they couldn't even really stand behind in the wake of George Floyd. And it wasn't really good for business, you know. And I think that whatever infrastructure comes out, it has to be something that's sustainable and that's mutually beneficial. Because at the end of the day, I look at the thirds of America. You know, it's a third of America that's poor whites, a third of America that's poor blacks, a third of America that's poor Hispanics, and it's figuring out how we can lift all those ships to kind of grow our economy. And I think the approach from President Trump is going to be to kind of just like focus on that raw economic data to try to lift all ships and not try to pit each other against each other as it relates to that. But I mean, look, he's a polarizing figure. He says things, you know, and it kind of like, yeah, I know, right? It kind of had these kind of, rightfully so, thoughts on like, okay, is he really for people of color? But I think at the end of the day, the policy has shown up differently. You know, as you look at kind of the history of us working with, CDFIs as it relates to PPP and carving that out for more banking entities, or if we're looking at kind of the work we did around HBCUs, I think in practice it could kind of pan out a lot differently, but it'll be under a different name, different term, which I would think would probably be more historically disadvantaged communities.
I hope that you continue to advocate for words like diversity within the Republican Party because they're important.
Wow.
I mean, I think diversity is important to be competitive on the global scale, but I mean, diversity isn't just my whole thing is that, like, I'm diverse, obviously. I'm a black Republican, but when you look at I'm doing it as we talk. But when I look at corporations, maybe if they're hiring a black person, they want a black person to be a certain type of black person, and diversity is kind of hiring who's the best fit, and that also may be a person of color or maybe a woman. It shouldn't be an ideological thing when it comes to diversity. If a person's diverse, they have to believe a certain ideological way of thinking. It's all I'm saying.
Yeah. We've got about 4 minutes, and I don't have any questions from the audience, I don't believe. Either that or my iPad isn't working. So if I don't have any questions, we have 3.5 minutes here, so I want to give everyone a chance to kind of close us out. So there are many minority depository institutions represented here, and then there's our organizational MBA that represents the collective. What advice would you provide as we go into these, we're within the 30-day window, and the outcome is just around the corner. What advice would you leave with this group regarding advocacy for our interests? You know, the time is tight, and the administration will be different in less than 30 days. And so, you know, and I'll start with the strategists down there who've worked in various administrations, and then we'll just come back this way. So, Greg, we'll start with you.
And I don't, you never want to walk in a room and tell people how they should be the advocates, but you've asked us to do that. So what you often find, and those of you who have dealt with members' offices, I think it's human nature to come to people when you need something and not before you need something. And I have found that local district offices and congressional offices are often fairly accessible, and especially for smaller outfits. Introducing yourself as like, I'm working to grow jobs here. Any conversation around a congressional office focused on, we are growing jobs, we have some jobs, we want to grow more jobs, you know, is an entry point that is actually, I think, underutilized. I think, you know, there's a lot of conversations going in at like the Washington office. There's great fly-ins, which are super important. But that district office actually is the one when you actually run into like the headaches of bureaucracy, regardless of who wins, is actually who is most likely to help you navigate that bureaucracy and red tape. And so, again, you never want to walk in and say if I don't know what everybody is doing at the local level, but like that, asking to come in and introduce you and your business and your bank and what you're trying to do before anything is needed. In particular, if somebody just won and they're going to really have nothing going on for like 10 weeks, 11 weeks, it was kind of a slow time to meet some of the district staff. So
we're down to our last 2 minutes. So, Jerron, you go, and then we're just going to knock it out so we can keep on time.
I mean, look, my whole life goal is try to make some of the issues that are important, like capital infrastructure, nonpartisan issues. You know, and I think that if you're talking about advocacy, you know, you need to talk to both sides. You know, especially if you're talking economics. You know, it's just the reality. And what I've tried to spend my life doing more and more is trying to ensure that, you know, all communities are kind of weighing in on both sides of the aisle to kind of figure out solutions. And I'm an incrementalist. I think that we can get there over time, but like let's help some dominoes fall with some easy wins that can fly under the radar. That's going to eventually kind of help us kind of grow strong as a country.
Okay, so the numbers are in red, Terrence.
Look, I think the most important advocacy towards the final stretch of this election is advocating for a peaceful transfer of power. It is applying pressure to the powers that be, that the one side who said there will be a bloodshed if they lose need to grow up and accept that they might lose. That is going to destabilize not just the economy, but it will destabilize our democracy. If every election is contested for weeks and months, then every election cycle, markets are going to contract until America figures its shit out.
Yeah. Rob, bring us home.
So the last thing I'm going to say is something, I used to be a reporter for 20 years, and the most important thing to me are stories. So when you're making those advocacy, you've got to be the ones in the room telling them how your bank, how your MDI is making a difference, and really telling them how are you helping your communities, and you're making a tremendous difference. And I talk to MDIs and CDFIs and community banks every day that are making a tremendous difference in their communities. And once you can get policymakers to really understand it and see not just that you're there as a business, but who you are helping and how you are helping them, I think you will bring a lot of people along, and I think you'll be surprised how many people you'll bring along in both parties.
Thank you. Can you give my panelists another round of applause, please? Thank you so much.